community. There was no president in place. Therefore, again, according
Washington Journal, live every day at 7 a.m. Eastern. You'll find all of it online at cspan.org. We'll go back live now to the all-day discussion on climate change taking place at the National Academy of Sciences, hosted by Johns Hopkins University.
And we'll finish at 3 o'clock. So again, thank you, panelists, and I'll let Angela introduce our panelists. Thank you.
First panel, so I switched the lapel. Hopefully this will help. Okay, back in the hot seat. So the afternoon panel, championing climate change action. We are specifically looking at case studies of success and how we can use those successes to build a more sustainable and energy efficient and anti-climate change future. So I'll start by introducing our panelists. To my right is Kate Johnson. She's the Chief of Green Building, the Chief of the Green Building Climate Branch in DC. And so she is a local. If you have any ideas for DC, I'm sure she'd be interested in hearing them. I will do the same thing as I did in the morning panel, which is to ask, what are the big ideas that you have been thinking about recently that are kind of at the forefront of your mind?
Sure. So again, I work for the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment. So I think a theme that has really resonated not only in DC but across the U.S. Recently is the importance of action at the local level for actually showing what is possible when it comes to climate action. So earlier this year, our Mayor Bowser, signed the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Amendment Act of 2018, which is a big mouthful, but it is one of, if not the most ambitious piece of climate legislation to pass at the local level in the U.S. I have a feeling some folks in the room may have been involved, and there was a lot of organizing around passing that bill. I think it tackles climate in a couple different key ways. I think probably most importantly for a city like us is it addresses our existing buildings. And so that's a theme in a lot of the work that I do, why I work on both green building and climate change. The buildings account for about 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions in DC, which is a lot more than if you looked at the U.S. as a whole or if we were a more suburban or car-driven city. So buildings really are key, and we realize that most of the buildings that exist today are still going to be around in 2050 when we have a goal to be carbon neutral. So we can't ignore them. And so this policy for the first time requires large existing buildings to improve their energy performance. And it's going to have a really big impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also will save a lot of energy and a lot of money as it's implemented starting in 2021.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. Okay. I have so many questions, but obviously we need to, keep it moving here. So Marcus King, to Kate's right, is a senior fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. And we had a lot of points come up in the morning session about national security and about international approaches and the risks that people are facing outside of the U.S. And hopefully Marcus is going to be able to address some of those. So Marcus, what are some of the things that you've been thinking about critically over the past couple of months?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the Center for Climate and Security, our focus is really on the U.S. military establishment and related agencies. And so we find that there's engagement possibilities in mitigation, adaptation, and what I call consequences of failure to adapt to climate change. And I think some of the biggest successes have actually been on the mitigation side. DoD is the largest energy user in America, and by extension, probably the largest energy user in the world. I had the opportunity to represent them in the UNFCCC negotiations. And what I've found is I'm really what I refer to myself as a recovering climate negotiator. And I say that because I've really seen us moving from mitigation to adaptation. Some of the international instruments, like harm and damage under the UNFCCC, are now focused on adaptation. Again, some of the successes have been the U.S. Navy's been a leader. Biofuel, something called the Great Green Fleet under the Obama administration, where they used a biofuel blend for bunker fuels. The F/A-18 Hornet was also operated with a blend of fuel. And so there's that. But what we really look at is the changing roles and missions of the military based on climate impacts. Therefore, Hampton Roads, the largest military base in the world, is threatened by sea level rise, for example. We think about that. We think about the impact of storms and floods. So Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida had about $3 billion worth of damage from hurricanes Mitch and Irma. The floods out west in Offutt Military Base, they were relocating STRATCOM to that area, so those buildings were wiped out. And so these are the ways that climate change impacts the roles and missions of the military, and I really think about that. But I mentioned sort of that third bucket, which was the consequences of failure to adapt to climate change. And so these are the what we also refer to as the varsity level international problems. And so instability in countries that are already important to U.S. security interests, where climate change acts as a threat multiplier, exacerbating problems that already exist, be that population, be that societal cleavages within a country. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about where that plays itself out. It's happened with the recent civil war in Syria, and also I focus on the Middle East and North Africa, so I've looked at Egypt, and many of the factors there related to climate impacts are coming together in a way that's frankly really scary. And I've spent time on my research and teaching looking at Middle East, North Africa.
So to Marcus's right, we have Chris McKinney. He is the founder and CEO of Millennium Rain Energy, which I think is a great name for a business. Got rain right in there. Tell me about your big projects, what your company does, and some of the big projects that you've been working on recently.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me here to speak today. It's been a real honor to be here and learned a lot of good stuff here, and I'm excited about it. Hydrogen is a really important element. It's the first element on the periodic chart, and it is a way to carry electrons. And to put hydrogen into perspective and to grasp the power of hydrogen, it is what the Big Bang started the whole universe, and everything that came to be today is from hydrogen originally. And so the sun runs on hydrogen. And so what we're doing is we're able to harness the power of hydrogen and be able to make it replace all fossil fuels. Anything that runs on gasoline, diesel fuel, natural gas, or propane will also run on hydrogen, but then emit no emissions. And then also it can be used to store electricity. And so one of the big things that we've just announced recently with the press release was that we're building a transcontinental hydrogen highway with 27 stations from California to New York, mostly along Interstate 70, 95, and 15. And that's coinciding with the 150th year anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad, where they drove the Golden Spike at Promontory Point, and those two trains came together for the first time. So it's very symbolic, and it's as big a deal, if not bigger than that was for our country. What people don't know is there's 6,000 cars currently in California running on hydrogen. There's 39 stations there. There's several in the Northeast in the New York area, and hydrogen stations there. There are 27,000 forklifts right now running on hydrogen in distribution centers of Walmart's, Amazon, BMW, Ace Hardware. And so we have, you were mentioning the military, we have hydrogen systems at the Air Force Base, Navy Research Lab here in Washington, D.C., and soon to be at the Army. So they're already jumping on board with hydrogen, and it's much bigger and much more prevalent than most people think. And the last thing would be that that we have the opportunity to use hydrogen to mass storage, and it is much cheaper than batteries. You need batteries. It won't eliminate batteries because you have to have batteries in the system. But hydrogen on a scale where batteries may be $250 to $300 a kilowatt hour, hydrogen could be stored at $3.50 a kilowatt hour. It's a game changer when it comes to storing mass grid electricity and being able to transport those electrons into something that is more diverse than just electrons like you would get out of a battery. Now you can use it as transportation fuel, and it can be transported in tanks. So we're really excited about the future of hydrogen.
I think that's fascinating. I have so many questions. This is going to be great. Tom Peterson, who has had many titles and currently has many titles, but I'm going to go with this one, the President and CEO of Center for Climate Strategies. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
Okay, good. So, Tom, tell me about, you've had a long career in climate and thinking about sustainability, and I'd like to ask you what you've been thinking about recently that, you know, maybe specifically related to our theme here, which is case studies of successes in leadership.
Well, thank you for being here. And in addition to my role as the president and CEO for the Center for Climate Strategies, I'm an adjunct professor here at Johns Hopkins and teach in two programs, Energy Policy and Climate and the Global Security Center. Really, those worlds come together for me all of the time, and I'm thankful that they do. But what's really been on my mind very much is how we can be successful at teaching people of all ages, but particularly people who are early in their careers, how they can become leaders in this area and how they can solve these problems. We can't do this alone. We've got to multiply the capabilities that are required to solve this problem quite broadly. So our work in the last few years, but it's been very intensively focused in this last few months, has been in developing nations, and most particularly in Africa. And just to give some sense of the importance of that, the developing world will be responsible for most of the greenhouse gas emissions in the future by a very, very large factor. This is sort of the defining problem of this issue in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation going forward. Solving it is then extremely important, and it's a bit complicated. One of the things that we're focused on is teaching people in Africa, whether it's policymakers, whether it's people in businesses, whether it's educational institutions or investors, how to go about doing two very important things. One is, how do you generate private investment at the levels that are needed to fund the kinds of activities that will really make a difference, not only for climate change, but for other very important national priorities like economic development. That's the second part of what we are working very hard to do, is to teach people how to address the climate change issue as well as addressing their economic security needs through very specific actions that occur in all of the sectors. It's pretty clear everywhere you go in the world, including here in the United States, where we spent most of our early years working, it's very difficult to move forward and implement climate change actions at the kind of scale that is needed unless they are also providing economic benefits. And so we have to learn how to do these things together. To shine a quick light on Africa, in 15 years the projections are that 50%, actually over 50% of all of the world's labor force will be in Africa. The children that we see today are going to be looking for jobs in 15 years. More than half of the world's workers will be in Africa. If we are able to generate the kinds of jobs and opportunities that they need, that will be great. If we don't, it won't be great. And the ability to solve this climate change problem is absolutely tied up in our ability to solve that problem, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Latin America and the Caribbean, worldwide. I think also what we're discovering is some of the most exciting and innovative things that are happening in the world today are happening in the developing countries. And we're excited that that's happening, but we'd like to be able to bring that back home here to the United States and maybe get back in the saddle a little bit here.
I would like that too. I think everyone on this panel would enjoy that very much. I want to start off with Marcus, because I want to talk about the idea of national security and your experience and what you've seen over the past few years working in this specifically. We know the Middle East and Northern Africa are obviously national security. It's a risk for the military, and like you said, climate change is a threat multiplier, a term that I think is a fabulous term, but in its use is quite threatening. So what are the specific things that you're seeing in places like Syria and Egypt that are a risk, and how is climate change multiplying that threat for the military, and what can be done to mitigate it?
Okay, easy questions.
Right. I know you want to talk about Syria and Egypt, so here we go.
Well, the intelligence community, for example, has recognized the extent of the threat of climate change to national security, and again to the roles and missions of the military. Also the U.S. Congress, which has called for the combatant commanders of each region to take stock of what the impacts that they're witnessing of climate change are and report back to this. So we do have institutional buy-in, at least within the security community, that there are emerging problems. I talk about a conflict spectrum, so I look at pre-conflict, I look at the conduct of conflict itself, acceleration of conflict, and then post-conflict peace building. And so within the Middle East and North Africa, climate change can play a role in all three of those areas. Speaking about Syria, being very careful, there was the example of climate change as a driver, and how that manifested itself was in drought. The Middle East, North Africa are either chronically dry countries or countries that are experiencing a technical drought. So what we found as the causal factor in Syria was the idea that the cereal harvests were affected by the drought that year. For example, in Russia, where Syria got a lot of its wheat from. Also, farmers in the south of the country were experiencing bad harvests and yields as well. All of this driving people to the peripheries of cities, military-age males, were some of those that around Daraa then started the violent protests against the regime that kind of led more and more to the conflict there. But I also look at this idea of a threat multiplier, and so that might play itself out more in Egypt. So, for example, I looked at the idea of Arab Spring coming a little bit earlier based on climate change. So what does that mean? I said that climate change can exacerbate problems that are already existing there. So what are the problems? The problems are they're challenged, by a very narrow agricultural zone where they're able to grow food. They grow cotton, which is water intensive sometimes instead of food crops. Most of the population is on a floodplain, on a delta. So we see these factors coming into play. Increased desertification, for example, is reducing the amount of arable land. Saline intrusion is affecting the quality of the soil on the floodplain. So what does this mean? Populations might need to move. There aren't a lot of good options in the region for dislocated people, for example. So I see this as a threat multiplier, but it's also an instability accelerant, right? Because there is existing instability, and I think it may become worse. And so within the sort of documents, the Quadrennial Defense Review, the other documents that the Pentagon puts out, you saw the idea a few years ago of a threat multiplier where climate change exacerbated already existing conditions. Then the nomenclature in 2010, 2014 moved to climate change as an instability accelerant. So there was already ongoing conflict, and then climate change made it that much worse. And now we're talking about a new dimension we're in, which is a catalyst for conflict, so climate being a catalyst for conflict. And so that's what we've seen, for example, in a newer case of Syria.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the military is empowering their leaders to document what they're seeing. Can you give us any examples of things that they are seeing that would raise flags in the Pentagon or in the military? If you have any specific examples, I'd be really interested in hearing some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I briefly touched on the idea of Hampton Roads
Sure, yeah.
and the sea level rise as threat to the infrastructure there. But there's another example I use fairly frequently, which is the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. The United States military leases it from Great Britain. Ironically, it was a strategic bomber base in earlier times when we faced another existential threat, and that was nuclear annihilation. But ironically now it serves as a hub for increased humanitarian operations in response to things like cyclones in the Pacific. Admiral Locklear, who was the combatant commander in the Pacific, noted that more of their missions, what they call evolutions, had to do with humanitarian assistance than actual training. And so they really needed this hub for logistical purposes. But now we're seeing that the average elevation in Diego Garcia is 3 feet. Sea level rise by the end of the century will probably exceed that. The runways are already being affected. So this is an example where the base that's being used as a humanitarian platform to respond to the effects of climate change is itself being eroded by climate change.
Right, and you can't, I mean, the military exists in these areas, and so at the same time that they are trying to battle the effects of climate change, they're feeling them themselves, and they're being hindered themselves. I would like to skip over to hydrogen a little bit because so chemistry was not always my forte. I'm more of a physics girl, so you have to forgive me. But I want you to walk us through how your technology in particular produces hydrogen and how that differs from, I think, maybe what we're all thinking of hydrogen, which is it comes to you in a tank that looks like this. But what you're doing is you're actually producing it for little to no cost, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yes. So hydrogen electrolysis is the separation of oxygen and hydrogen from water. And so you apply a DC electric current across a stack of cells, and hydrogen comes off on one side and oxygen comes off on the other. And we created a patented membrane that helps keep those separated. And then we build hydrogen infrastructure doing that. And there's 5 things needed for that. You have to have, you have to make the hydrogen, which we do with water electrolysis, a patented process that we created of our own. But that process has been around for years and years, you know, going way back before World War I even. And so then you have to make it, you have to purify it to fuel cell grade quality, you have to compress it to high pressures to get more of it into a smaller space, and then you have to be able to store it, and then you have to be able to dispense it into a vehicle or something that's going to use it to transport it or use it someplace else in transportation. So the electrolysis process is what we use. Now, it's important to understand that 98% of all the hydrogen in the world today is produced from steam methane reforming of natural gas, which has a CO2 element to that. This does not. It's a much cleaner way, and then the electricity source that is going into the electrolysis can come from wind or solar or geothermal or wave energy or hydroelectric. So then it becomes completely renewable, completely sustainable, completely green, no harmful emissions. It is the perfect energy storage and source.
How much energy does this process take? You know, a lot of our new emerging technologies are still relying on, at some point in the process, fossil fuels. And so that's kind of where we're starting at with hydrogen, correct? Or at least with your process. So give me an idea of how much energy it takes to do this, and then how much benefit we're getting out of it at the end.
So the exact number based on third-party analyses that have been done on our specific system is 48 kilowatt hours per kilogram. The efficiency rate of our production is somewhere around 63% lower heating value percentage. Then when you put it into a fuel cell, fuel cells average between 55 and 60% efficient at converting that hydrogen back into electricity. So it's about a 35% round trip efficiency. And so it stacks up fairly well against other energy carriers if you actually take into consideration all the other factors that are behind that. Like when you look at gasoline, no one ever, takes it from cradle to grave. They're just looking at the cost and how far you go in your tank. But there's a lot of energy that expends prior to getting to that. And so when you look at it on a full-scale basis, it's really even. And I think that a lot of the impact, though, that it has on the environment is extraordinary. Recently, we did an impact study, and it showed that we could, if we execute our business plan just as a company of our own of putting 30,000 hydrogen stations across the United States in the next 20 years, it would save 17 billion metric tons of CO2 over that 20-year period of time. And to put that into perspective, the George Bush aircraft carrier weighs 100,000 metric tons. So 10 of those would be 1 million, 1,000 of those would be 1 billion, and then 17 of those, could you imagine that many aircraft carriers piled up in a pile someplace? That's a lot of CO2. And then we just saw some recent other news where McKinsey reported that it'll save 6 gigatons of CO2 by 2050, and it will make 30 million new jobs, and that'll be a $2.5 trillion industry by 2050.
Now, when you say hydrogen stations, do you mean like a gas station? I pull my car into it and I fill up my tank?
Yes, right.
Interesting.
Yes. And so that's just one market in the United States. There are actually 6 different markets that our product will go into without changing the product. And we're the first company in the world to have certified our products. We've just recently received an attestation of certification to IR 3-18 of CSA's codes and standards. And so this means that these stations can be factory produced and stamped that they meet all the codes and standards to be safely deployed.
So I want to use that as a jumping off point to ask Kate about the technologies that DC has either already implemented or is implementing. And I know that, like you said, one of DC's biggest challenges is the fact that a lot of it comes from buildings. And as we know, DC has a lot of very old, very large, with big cavernous halls, buildings that are extremely not efficient. And so what kind of technology is either the city or is the city supporting for these buildings to, rein them in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, although I will add, I'm also not a chemist, so following.
Hey, I'm not either.
All we know is there was water, and now there's hydrogen and oxygen in there separate. So that's electricity at some point.
So I think to start, I would say that for a lot of buildings, the solution isn't necessarily new technology that we need to be talking about. It's pretty not basic, but pretty standard stuff, like making sure on the residential side, insulation and weatherization. So we actually think we can get a lot of energy efficiency before even tapping into some of the new exciting technologies.
That's great.
Yeah, and that's obviously the cheapest way to go. But if we're going to get to carbon neutrality, we know at some point all of our buildings essentially are going to have to be net zero energy. And so that's beyond kind of standard building technology. So we're looking at, there's a couple recent examples of more emerging technologies. So how many folks here are members of the American Geophysical Union? Figured there would be a few. So AGU's headquarters, their retrofit project is the first net zero energy commercial retrofit project in DC. We just gave them an award a couple weeks ago. They are using wastewater thermal, and as far as we know, this is the first application in DC where their heating and cooling source for the building is they're tapped into the sewer that runs under their building. So again, it's actually not crazy new technology, but it's just using something in a very different way. So we're really interested in where else that can work, and DC Water, our water utility, is really interested in it. We also have some projects that are looking at geothermal, both at a building scale and also at a district scale, so that's exciting. And then we're making a lot of investments in solar. Solar is something that just has a lot of co-benefits for us. So we have a pretty lofty goal of providing, at no cost, solar to 100,000 low-income households in DC to offset their utility bills by at least 50%. So we're recognizing that our climate action also helps to help the city achieve its equity and affordability goals, and solar is one of kind of the key technologies that will enable us to do that.
That's great. Speaking of, we have a long way to go, and that's good news, is that a lot of these buildings were built with almost no energy efficiency, and so there's nowhere to go but up in DC, which is great news. Tom, I'm interested in hearing, now that we've heard from, our very local expert in building and our national security expert and our emerging technology, you work very closely with grad students. And I'm wondering where you see their passions and where you see their interests most. If it's in any of these areas or if it's something else related to climate change, what sets a spark off in their eye that you're seeing?
So, yeah, great question. And I started working with graduate students 15 years ago, and there have been a few changes, I would say, over that time. I would just note one of the very big changes that has happened is that when I started 15 years ago, and I taught climate change law and policy at Penn State, for instance, 15 years ago, and they've been climate change related courses. Honestly, it was pretty rare to hear a student talk about having been personally exposed to some sort of extreme or catastrophic climate change event. Today, it's common. And I started picking this up a couple of years ago. I started hearing more stories from them, and now I actually have a question in our discussion boards for our class every week to invite them to reflect on a personal experience that's related to the issue that we're talking about. And it's kind of amazing to hear what they have to say now. So this has really been personalized for them. It's here, it's now, it's me. The stories they tell are very eye-opening, I would say graphic. To give you an example, I think some of the things that seem to affect the students the most in terms of their experience with climate change is witnessing the deaths of animals. They couldn't escape harm's way. Or witnessing people who were stuck in their own circumstances and really couldn't get out. And this, I can tell this troubles them quite a bit. And so that's very much on their mind as they come to this issue. And it's a big shift from where we were 15 years ago when things were abstract. 15 years ago, 25 years ago, we used to hear President Clinton talk about we can hear the whistle blowing, but we can't see the train, talking about how climate change is really a delayed effect phenomena. Well, the trains are here now, right? And we can see the train wrecks and we can see what's going to happen in the future. So this is a very big transformation. We've also seen a huge transformation in terms of the proliferation of solutions. When I was in Kyoto in the mid-90s with our congressional delegation, when I was with the White House and they were receiving the news on the targets the president was proposing, they were, I think, a little bit shocked and said, where are all the tons going to come from and what are the folks back home going to have to do? We did not have great answers. We waved our hands a bit about technology and market-based solutions. The kinds of things you're hearing on this panel today are really the sort of evidence of now the specific solutions that we have in all of the different sectors to play with. Students today now can grapple with a good problem, I would say, which is an overabundance of solutions and needing to get smart and systematic about how you pick and design the right ones. But I would have to add there's one other thing that's on their minds, and I think just about everybody's, and that is there's another kind of risk and fear that they internalize, and it's economic fear. And let me just put this into a little bit of perspective. Poverty is real here in the United States, and it's concentrated in young people. And believe it or not, 40% of all adults in the United States are 1 month of pay away from losing their home, their rent, their mortgage. 40% of people in the United States cannot come up with $400 for an emergency expense. Now, the other interesting thing is that 50% of our country's wealth is tied up in 1% of its people. So we have some structural problems here. But this is the dual reality they live with. They now feel climate change is real. It is something that threatens them or their families and their future, and it's a personal thing to them. But their economic fears are equally, if not greater, on their mind, and a reality they have to face. And like many Americans, they live on the edge, and there's no guarantee that they won't spend their whole lives living on the edge. Well, that's the picture of our whole world. Everybody's living on the edge virtually, and so we've got to figure out a way to fix this problem that is, there's more than one dimension. And I just want to add, I think, unfortunately, there has been an effort to improperly connect the dots between those economic fears and those climate fears and suggest that the reason that we're afraid economically is because we're taking action on climate change or any other environmental issue. I think that's false and demonstrably false, but it's been used as a divisive mechanism to keep us from making progress on this issue. So we have to get past that too. But as we work with students and young people and people everywhere in the world, I think today we now have the unfortunate advantage of this being a very real issue, but also the advantage of having an awful lot to work with in terms of the actual cases that can work and how we can go about applying them.
Can I get you to dig in a little bit on that point in terms of, you mentioned to me earlier that you can see demonstrable, like tangible things that we can do in each of these sectors. And so maybe we know that transportation is obviously the biggest user and emitter. So let's start with transportation, and then if we could talk about a couple other sectors that you have actionable things that can be done now in your experience.
And I'm going to focus for the moment on mitigation and not adaptation. There's a little bit of overlap, but slightly different animals. Mitigation is we're reducing underlying risk. Adaptation is we're adjusting to the vulnerabilities that result. So on the mitigation side, we have economic sectors. We like to break down the way that emissions are released in the atmosphere by humans and their activities by breaking them into different activity areas or economic sectors. So transportation is one of them. And so there's this old notion of a three-legged stool, that the farmer used to milk the cow, and it's getting the carbon out of the fuels, right, making the vehicles more efficient, and then improving our infrastructure and our development patterns so people don't have to drive so far. So this would be an example of 3 general strategies within a sector. And you can imagine then within those general strategies much more specific examples of how they could be implemented, whether it's hydrogen in terms of direct fuels, et cetera. Then you can shift to every single sector, and you can see this framework of general strategies that we could use. In forestry, the general strategy is we want to protect the forests that we have. We want to manage them better. We want to recover and restore the forests we've lost. We want to create new forests, whether they're rural or urban, and we want our forests to become a source of bioenergy and biomaterials that reduces the embedded carbon and things. So those are general strategies. In forestry, we have general strategies in agriculture, getting the energy inputs out of production, storing carbon in the soil so we don't lose it, shifting to those kinds of crops that are more efficient in terms of the inputs to production, making feed more efficient for animals to digest, whether it's poultry, livestock, and then treating their waste. We go into residential, commercial, industrial, institutional issues, making our processes for commercial and industrial production more efficient and learning how to save energy, for instance, as we're doing here in Washington, D.C. We look at the power sector. We want to get the carbon out of the direct fuels we use, whether it's hydrogen or anything else in the fossil fuel range, but we just want to become also more efficient and lower carbon footprint across the board in terms of the production. We want to shift to renewables, for instance, things that have a lower carbon level. We also want to get more efficient in terms of how we distribute it by wire, by pipeline, whatever means. And I think reuse, recycle, reduce. So we see, I mentioned databases that we'll have in them today. There are many databases. We started one when we first started the Center for Climate Strategies that are broken down by sectors, have live examples of these things that are occurring somewhere. We have now many of these, and they're very important worldwide. And the last one we did in either Ukraine or Guatemala had 1,100 actions in it, for instance. But it's all about the sectors and then these breakdowns, and you can see how that gets more and more specific. And you can imagine also teaching people how to go through a process of searching for the best solutions, having that kind of a tool available, and knowing as they do that, they want to look for things that reduce emissions, and so we combine that with research on emissions. We call these baselines, knowing where the junk comes from. But we also match this with how you screen and select the best of these options to create jobs, to create investment, to maintain stability, to improve environmental health and equity issues. So we get into multi-objective decision-making and policies that work in a number of areas at the same time. Those are the things that do advance. They do become implemented. They are popular. Oftentimes, they're not described as climate change actions. It's recycling. It's modernization of industry. It's whatever. But along the way, they reduce emissions, and they work.
So, Kate, we're talking a lot about the multi-pronged approach to things, and I'm assuming that DC's climate plan is a multi-pronged approach, and it's not just about buildings. For example, one of the really great posters out in the hall at lunch was about the way that gentrification in Atlanta specifically was this poster, but the way gentrification is going to kind of multiply the effect of emissions and climate stress in that region. If you happen to notice the little chart in the upper right-hand corner of that poster, DC was #1 in terms of rate of gentrification. Atlanta was #5. So I wanted to ask how gentrification in DC is weighing in or affecting or how it was considered in your climate action plan, and what the district is trying to do to ease that burden both for the people and for the environment.
Sure. That's my easy question, right?
Yeah, solve gentrification for us real quick, and climate change at the same time.
Right. Well, I think for us, we followed a pretty similar process to what Tom just described. So the Clean Energy DC plan is our climate action plan, but then we also have Sustainable DC, which is our much more comprehensive sustainability plan. And I think for all of those, we identified a number of different actions and then chose the ones that had the greatest potential to solve some of the other challenges that we know that we're facing as a city. When we launched the update to Sustainable DC, we did a pretty open-ended survey of anyone who lived, worked, or played in the district could fill out the survey, and we asked them, what do you like about your neighborhood and what do you want to see improved? And one of the #1 issues that came through in that study were people were worried about the affordability of living in DC. And I think it's important to think about affordability, not just in terms of housing, but in terms of transportation, energy. So I've seen similar studies where we don't rank very high in terms of energy burden, for example. So the percentage of your income that is going towards paying utility bills. So all of these things are related, right? If you reduce one and not the others, you haven't really solved an affordability problem. So a couple examples of what we're trying to do there. On the housing affordability side, DC invests more in new and preserving affordable housing on like a per capita basis probably than just about any other city. From a climate perspective, I think it's important that we, for a long time, have had requirements on any project that's being built with public funding has to meet kind of above code building standards. So this is our Green Building Act. It has meant that affordable housing, so money that or housing that was built with public dollars, is greener and more efficient than market rate housing, which is in the new space. So that's unique. At the same time, we're addressing energy burden through our Solar for All program. So one of the easiest ways to lower your energy burden is to no longer have a utility bill. And if you have solar, that's a good way to do that. We also have a variety of programs on the energy efficiency side targeted at lower income residents through a number of different avenues. And then on the transportation side, we recognize that transportation infrastructure is not distributed equally across the district. And so we look at making sure that we have alternative transportation in the areas that need it most. And that could be biking, that could be metro rail, metro bus. So we have a lens through which we're looking at improving mobility and accessibility, which helps people not have to own a car, which is an affordability thing. So all of this stuff is related, and sometimes it can be hard to unpack. I think, like Tom said, a lot of policy we've put forward in the city hasn't been necessarily because of climate change, but it makes the city more livable and more equitable. And so, yeah, and as sort of a nice byproduct, has helped us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. So climate change affects everything, and so it makes sense that if you're developing a sustainability plan, you're also going to be looking at your other goals, because you can reach other goals by being more sustainable. And they're they kind of naturally go hand in hand. I'm interested in what Chris might have to say about ways in which hydrogen stations and some of, even going beyond hydrogen, but just alternative fuels and greener fuels could help a city like DC or any other big city who's struggling with these things become more sustainable and perhaps become more affordable.
Well, the way hydrogen in particular could do that would be in the area of storage. For instance, in California, they have issues because there's so much solar went on so fast that it messes with the grid.
Right.
And they've got this thing they call the duck curve. And it's been talked about a lot. And there are times when, it messes with the amount of power that's on the grid versus the amount of power that's coming off. And so hydrogen can be used to store the excess energy instead of shutting it down, or what they call curtailing it. This happens in wind a lot in Texas, for instance. In Texas is the biggest wind producer of any state we have by far, and we have a hydrogen generator on a farm in Texas, and he has 2 big wind turbines on his farm that he leases the land to put the turbines out. So he gets this report from the big wind farm company, and he showed it to me, and there are times when they're paying them 2 cents a kilowatt hour not to put the electricity on the grid.
Storing it. When
they could be storing it and then shifting it to the daytime and using fuel cells to put it on there, and then they can levelize the load. The other thing is that the way hydrogen generators work, they become a load bank for when there is more energy. You can dump that energy into the hydrogen generator, keep those turbines spinning. General Electric just came out with a report 2 weeks ago where they now believe hydrogen will be the way that they can use to store electricity that they're producing with their natural gas turbines, because there's so much inefficiency in slowing the turbines down at night and then ramping them back up in the morning to follow the power demand, that if they could keep them running the whole time, they'd be more efficient, but there needs to be a way to store it. So storage is really the best way for cities to be able to utilize hydrogen to help them adapt renewable energies.
So when you talk about hydrogen as storage, I want to be clear so that people understand. It's that, let's say a wind turbine was creating more energy than needed at the time, so you've got this surplus. What you're suggesting is we take that energy, we take that electricity and use it to power the electrolysis in your process, which would then create the hydrogen, which is basically creating fuel. It's like creating fuel for free.
Exactly.
Given that it is, I'm imagining that it is entirely possible to set up a hydrogen generator that only exists for a storage purpose, and then to use that fuel when needed. Is
Absolutely.
that true? So you don't
Yes.
even really need to use fossil fuels to generate the hydrogen.
Not at all.
You could actually, in places like California and Texas, just completely run it on the overflow, on the surplus.
That's right. That's right. And see, the interesting thing about hydrogen is that, as I alluded to earlier, it's an energy carrier. So when you store hydrogen, or when you store electricity from wind and solar or other sources in batteries, the only thing, you're putting electrons in the battery and you get electrons out. When you store in the form of hydrogen, you can get electrons back out by running it through a fuel cell. But then it can also replace transportation fuel of all types. And then so it becomes you can diversify the renewable energy grid and the electrons that are flowing in from the grid to not just be used as electrons on the grid anymore. And another thing is in the future, what I envision is they make these tubes that are about this big around that will hold about 3,000 psi, of pounds per square inch of pressure. And instead of having electric lines with on telephone poles with using up all of our copper and plastics for insulation on that copper, and then having the line losses of transmitting AC electric current across miles and miles and miles, you simply take your hydrogen system that you've got your wind and your solar farm making hydrogen at your electrolyzer and your big giant storage tanks of hydrogen, and you put a compressor on it and it feeds that through those tubes. Those tubes then also become storage. And then when it gets to the point of use, there's a fuel cell on site at the point of use that turns it into electricity. So the efficiencies go way up. And then in the future, I think you'll see all of the homes and businesses transition to DC power, back the way Edison originally envisioned it, okay? And because it's a much more efficient at the point. You can't wheel very long DC because it doesn't travel very far. That's why we went to AC. But in the future, I think and we're already seeing it today, they have converters that convert AC to DC so that you have less power usage at each home. But I think that'll be a huge thing that you'll be able to see in the future, yeah, definitely.
One more question, the big question. Is hydrogen safe?
I'm glad you brought that up.
And how do we know it's safe? And give me, I want tangible examples. Prove to me, Chris, that I am not going to blow up if I drive a hydrogen car, okay?
So everybody that drove here or rode here in a cab today rode here with 20 or 30 gallons of gasoline or diesel fuel under your seat. And hydrogen is, gasoline and diesel fuel is mostly hydrogen. It's just dirty hydrogen. So your world's already running on hydrogen right now, you just don't know it. And so I can take an ice pick and I can stick in your gas tank, and all the gasoline's going to fall out on the ground, and you move the car, and 5 days later that gas, you could still light it. But there's tests, and the military's done this, where they've tried to shoot it with different types of rounds of ammunition, and some of the rounds actually bounce off and don't even penetrate the tank. And then if they do penetrate the tank, it's just a gas release, and hydrogen is 15 times lighter than air. And so it travels upwards at 45 miles an hour. So within 2-3 minutes, the whole thing's evacuated, and you couldn't light it if you tried to. It's gone. And in that spill on the gasoline, that's terrible for the environment. If it's on grass, it's going to be dead for the next 10 years. but the hydrogen goes up and it doesn't hurt anything. Now, we did an experiment when we delivered our first system in Hawaii, we took a Christmas bulb and broke the hermetically sealed tip off of it, and we stuck it up inside a balloon, and we filled that balloon full of hydrogen directly out of our hydrogen generator, even before it went through our purifier. And the hydrogen balloon was about this big, and then we got a 25-foot cord and we put it on a battery and we pushed a button, and the light bulb came on and it glued just like a Christmas bulb on the inside. So here you have a fire that is exposed to hydrogen, surrounded by hydrogen, and it did not ignite. And the reason that is because there's no oxygen in it. As long as you have less than 4% oxygen in your hydrogen, it's not explosive. And so we separate the hydrogen completely out, and our hydrogen is 99.99 pure
That's what
hydrogen.
you meant by purification.
Yeah. And that's what makes it safe, and it's safer. As a matter of fact, in the codes and standards committees that I'm on, we often discuss that if hydrogen had been what we started with instead of fossil fuels, and now we've discovered fossil fuels and we were trying to switch to that, the codes and standards people would never allow it, because diesel fuel and gasoline are much more dangerous than hydrogen is.
You're selling me on this. One more question. Is the purification issue where the Hindenburg went wrong?
No. So the Hindenburg issue, if you look at history, there's been a lot of study on this now. They actually, they were concerned about when you heat something up, any gas, and it gets heavier. Like, that's how hot air balloons rise. So they created a exterior paint that they could put on the thing to reflect sun. Well, that's made up the same chemistry now that we use for jet fuel. So they made the exterior of their thing highly flammable. And so somewhere along the line, there was a little spark, ignited that. And if you take this room, like a quarter of this room, there were 17 bags that big of hydrogen on board that thing. And if you look back at the black and white video of that, as it caught fire and the fire moved through the thing, there were no explosions. But there were 17 bags as big as half of this room in that thing, and not one explosion as the fire penetrated each one of those bags.
So what you're saying is that the exterior jet fuel paint gave hydrogen a bad name.
Yeah, the way it turns out, yeah. But it's all about education, and that's why we need our universities and high schools and to do that. And we've developed an actual system that's a small, scalable system that you can put on a desktop and teach about hydrogen and make it right there in front of people. And that's what we have to do, is we really have to get the education out, because we need workers, and workers nobody knows about this stuff. So we're having to create our own curriculum to teach it.
So final question before we turn to the audience is for Marcus, and I want to stay on this emerging technologies. What have you seen the military either implement or are they keenly interested in? What are they investing in your knowledge? Or what are the potentials for the future for them?
Absolutely. So I hope I've presented at least a somewhat convincing case that we're facing unprecedented risk now related to climate change. But the good news is that we have unprecedented capacity to deal with these risks. And so what are those capacities? And by we, I mean the United States and the U.S. government. What are these capacities? We have Earth observation platforms, satellite technology to track weather. We're improving the predictive analysis for short-term weather events, not only climate modeling. So the NOAA has been working on some of this as well. We've got supercomputing capacity that allows to create more and more accurate climate models. And then finally, we have big data, a lot of data that's resident within, say, the United States government. So a lot of people don't know the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They're a civil agency, but also they assist the military abroad. So they've been involved, for example, in letting countries understand exactly what water assets they have in order for them to distribute them more fairly. So that's an example of an emerging group. And then the emerging technologies, I think, have to do with improving medium-term weather forecasting and better models. And so I just wanted to say that I'm really hopeful about the ability to do this. But we look at increasing capacity to what I would say marry the models that, say, intelligence agencies look at, which are what are potential socio-economic developments, what are potential political developments, and then looking at the climate modeling itself, which is improving, and then trying to put those together in a synthesis. And I think we can do that here in the United States in a way that's productive to allies. It's productive to provide this information to countries that are of national security concern to the United States.
All right. If anyone has questions for our panelists, again, we have 2 microphones, one over here, one here, if we can line up behind them. We had no shortage of questions in the first session, so I imagine there will be some good ones now. Let's start on the left this time.
Yes, Mr. Peterson, you mentioned that major emitters of greenhouse gases will be from the countries of Africa, developing countries. And if they're developing countries, I'm wondering, why aren't we introducing emerging technologies and strategies in the earlier stages of their development so as to allay the imminence of their emissions? Are there political, economic, social, cultural, traditional, tribal? What are the impediments to introducing that stuff so we don't have the problems later on?
It's a great question. So as we work with people who are in positions of governmental leadership in these countries, as well as people who are leaders in communities and leaders in businesses, I think they all have on their minds the same kinds of things that we've had on our minds here in the United States about moving forward and tackling this issue. They have existing priorities that they are very, very concerned about. I mentioned their economic priorities. They need to be able to grow. They need to be able to employ more people. They need to be able to improve their income rates. And then they have basic issues in terms of energy access. In sub-Saharan Africa, 2/3 of people do not have access to electricity. There are a lot of very basic needs that people have that are at the top of the priority list, what we call burning priorities. It's very important for them to know that there is a way for them to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint, which they're supportive of, generically, I must say, but in a way that doesn't stand in the way of reaching these other goals and can actually help them reach these other goals. So if they believe that there's potentially a positive connection between taking action on the environment or climate and then improving their economic security and their energy security, then they are very interested in rolling up their sleeves and figuring out how exactly to make that work for them back home. If these things look like they're in conflict, then they're quite concerned about it. So you can imagine that that's the most important part of getting the conversation started. You get to the next stage of what's important then, they want to make sure that there's money and manpower behind these programs that they need to put in place. They want to make sure that their public is supportive of this, and that involves a two-way communication with the public. The public needs to get involved with policy making that takes place in government. They also need to have their own capacities to do this kind of work themselves instead of depending on somebody from another country to come in and do this for them. So there's a little bit of a formula that you can see that's required, but the very beginning of it is what we call alignment of priorities. They have to know that the things we really care about now are things that are consistent with what we can do as we tackle this emerging problem.
And on the right.
Hey, this question is for Kate. My name is Brian Durham. I'm in town from Charleston, South Carolina. The biggest threats that we face as a city are coastal flooding and sea level rise, but we also have a major affordable housing crisis. So I was really intrigued by one of the programs that you mentioned earlier, where you're going to be adding solar onto to underprivileged homes, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that from maybe on the funding side. Like, is that internally funded, or is that something external, like a grant? And maybe kind of how you're figuring out where those solar panels are going to be going, and how you're dealing with things like roofs that are in terrible shape, and how you're picking which homes are actually getting those solar panels.
Welcome to the district. We are also experiencing sea level rise, even though people don't think of us as coastal as Charleston.
I didn't get to ask you about that, but that's we live on a tidal basin, so yeah, it's significant.
Both the Anacostia and the Potomac rivers are tidal. So, so the program that I mentioned is called Solar for All, and it is funded primarily through compliance with our renewable energy standard or renewable portfolio standard. So we have a policy where, it was just updated, 100% of the electricity sold in the district is going to come from renewable sources by 2032. And then within that, 5% of that has to come from solar generated within the District of Columbia. So we've had that solar requirement in place for a while, but the requirement has outpaced development of solar, and so the electricity suppliers have been making essentially in lieu payments. So they haven't complied with the standard, so they're making these alternative compliance payments, which kind of sounds like a policy fail, and in some ways it is. But we have this pot of money that we can then use as a city to go out and support solar. And we've decided that if we are going to be subsidizing solar beyond the great financial incentives that already exist, that we're only going to subsidize solar for low and moderate income residents. So one thing we have learned, to your point about not everyone's roof can have solar, so maybe you might not own your roof. You might be renting in multifamily housing. So one thing that we have really been pushing lately is community solar. And this is essentially a virtual solar farm where it doesn't matter if the solar is on your roof. You can subscribe to it essentially, and the solar generated offsets your utility bill. Even if we have examples of this here in DC, if the solar is on a commercial office building downtown, you can still benefit by subscribing to that community solar project. And what we've found is that for a large commercial building, even if you totally cover your building in your roof and solar panels, it's going to offset 1%, maybe 2% of your load. So it just doesn't pencil out. And so what's happening is solar installers are saying, well, you have a very big flat roof. I'll pay you a little bit for your rooftop, or even maybe you'll do it pro bono, and then I'll use the solar generated to offset someone's utility bills where it is enough to really kind of make a difference.
That's very interesting. So, and the idea here being, not to get back to the gentrification part, but we do have an equity issue, right? And so this is meant to solve some of that equity issue. And so do you think that these initiatives will be enough to maybe, for example, keep someone who has always lived in Petworth, their family has always been in Petworth, that they will be able to continue to live there because you're reducing their energy bill to such a degree? Is that in the works?
I think it depends. I would point out that if you are owning your own home, you're actually already doing a lot better than many district residents. So I think what we're thinking more about is if you are trying to rent an apartment and you can't find any, and so it gets really complicated in the affordable housing space. Affordability is actually defined by a combination of your energy costs and your housing costs. So if we can bring down the energy cost, then rent is essentially you're able to pay more in rent.
Right.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. On the left.
Hi everyone. Thanks for being here. I think new energy innovation projects tend to face difficulty acquiring private financing. Generally because they have very long time horizons for payoff. and a lot of high risk associated with those kind of projects. So I was wondering if you could speak on some of the best practices associated with acquiring private financing and maybe some success stories.
In the United States or outside the United States?
Either or, I think.
Okay. Well, let me do a general thing real quick and then give you a little example from Ghana. So the general thing is, first, in order to fix this climate change problem, as I think was well established in an earlier panel, we can't just do one thing. We need to do a variety of things and be smart about which we're doing. And then when we pick those things, it's not enough to do a project. We have to do a whole bunch of projects. We can't just do one hydrogen station. We have to do a lot, which means we have to standardize and aggregate this technology that we need to put in place. We also need to do something else. After we're able to standardize and aggregate to bring this to full program and market scale, we need to turn this technology or this practice into a product or a service that we can sell, that turns into a transaction that has a revenue stream. Now we're talking. Because once you've got a revenue stream, then you can invite financing. But what if your revenue stream isn't enough to pay for all of your costs? Well, there's this thing called blended finance. And it's a combination of commercial finance that lives off a financial rate of return that's risk adjusted. But there's something called concessional or social impact, which means folks with money are willing to share it if you're doing some good for the world at the same time, and they're going to discount it, right? So you bring these together. And so this blending of these different sources is what we do for these products and services that are low carbon, if you will, so that we can assure that we have enough funding to cover the entire implementation, whatever cost gaps and timing issues are involved. And there's a procedure there. Then the big question becomes, what's the mechanism by which all of this gets pulled together? In the United States, we're advantaged by having extremely well-advanced contract law, for instance, that lets us pull these things together in a reliable way that's low risk. We also have very low macro risk in terms of inflation, default, currency risk, those kinds of things. So a little tougher in other countries. And so we have to do some additional things, like forming what we call a special purpose vehicle. It can be a special purpose fund, a special purpose corporation that can pull this together. This is where it's at now in terms of mechanisms that can arrange for blended finance for these standardized and aggregated projects and products that flow forward. Okay, this is our curriculum that we're doing for private investment mobilization now, and Ghana's our first country doing it. So we're doing a test case in Ghana, and I'm going to call it trash to treasure. But this is in the waste sector. And like many places, not only in Africa, but really worldwide, waste management programs aren't quite as well as advanced as they are here in the United States. There's a lot of trash laying around. And it's good news that people have water in plastic bottles because of health issues, but those plastic bottles are piling up. If you go to the beach in Ghana, you'll see real quickly. So we're working with them on a pilot called an integrated waste management system. And so normally when waste is collected and transported to a disposal facility, it's all a cost. We're trying to turn that into a revenue generating center that can generate private financing to support it. And so what we're doing is we're saying, let's take a look at all these different streams of waste that then go to some central facility. We're going to call it an integrated waste management facility. And then it treats it, and it does more than just dispose of it, stuff it in a landfill. It converts it into products that can be sold for revenues that can finance what was previously just a cost, right? So we use that to, some of it does have to go to the landfill, but some of it becomes recycled building materials that become sold, cooking gas, bioelectricity, compost, and a carbon credit. And so these are products that now have been converted from a policy measure, which is improved waste management, standardized and aggregated. In Ghana, there are 260 districts. We're showing how you can do this in a district and then replicate it nationally and structure this so that you're generating revenues from the creation of these products and their sales at scale in the market. Plow those revenues back into this whole system So it doesn't cost so much, and hopefully we'll turn a profit. But if there are gaps there, we're going to invite that concessional finance, the blended finance that I spoke of earlier, and we're forming a special purpose vehicle in Ghana for this purpose. So that would be an example of how we're going about leveraging this. By the way, it's really important because the best guess is at least 75% of all of the money that will be required to implement the Paris Agreement will have to come from the private sector. We don't have enough in the public sector to do this anymore, so we don't have any choice but to figure out how to do this. But in the process, let me just call out good friends in Ghana. Our partner is the Center for Science and Integrated Research in Ghana, and their specialization is product development. So we've got partners in other countries who are smart and willing to make these kinds of things happen.
On the right.
So my question is, give your name. I'm Esteban. My name is Esteban, and then my question is on the responsibility of climate change. So a lot of the framing of it is the onus is the person, or corporations, and the government. But I want to ask that, say that many of the climate solutions that are on the table aim to maintain current standards of living, that we keep our lights on 24/7, and that we export that standard of living to other countries and other communities. And I want to ask you, in your work, how do you hold yourself responsible or own that responsibility that the way that we live is the threat multiplier to other communities, marginalized communities around the world and in our country? And you kind of answered that with the gentrification question, but that is still within asking people to live in our standard of living. What are we doing to actually say we're going to reduce our standard of living, but still maintain a healthy way of living?
That you, that the government of DC kind of thinks about in terms of this balance between, maintaining a certain standard of living that we're all used to, but also knowing that that standard of living can often be very wasteful. So how did DC kind of decide what their benchmark was going to be in their sustainability plan?
Yeah, I guess I would challenge maybe the traditional assumptions about standard of living. Mm-hmm. So I think one thing that we know is cities are inherently more efficient from a perspective of greenhouse gas emissions. So like one of the best things you can do if you want to lower your greenhouse gas emissions is move to a city. And that's because the way that we define quality of life is a little bit different. And we're seeing this, it's a generational shift too, where cities enable you to not have to own a car, where I think in kind of the way you set that up, it's like everyone is striving to be able to own a car. I would flip it around and say if we do a really good job of designing our cities well, you don't have to own a car. You can walk or bike or take transit. And as a city dweller, that's actually improving standard of living to me. So I think there are ways to think about improving standard of living that also reduces your carbon footprint. Having access, a lot of people would like to have access to a better locally grown, more organic food. Well, the less distance we have to transport our food, the less greenhouse gas emissions that we're generating. So I think how we approach it is that we've tried to look for the solutions that improve the quality of life of our city, at the same time addressing greenhouse gas emissions. I think, so I do a lot of public engagement in our work, and I think it's like really important not to try to scapegoat anyone or make any moral judgments about the way people live their lives. I think it's the challenge for us is to find solutions that work for people and doesn't ask them to change some fundamental things about the way they live their life. One really, so I'm a vegetarian, so I think I can say this maybe a little bit more freely. I get really uncomfortable when we tell people to eat less meat. because a lot of people eat less meat because they can't afford it. And so I just think we have to be really careful with the actions we ask individuals to take, that we are being acknowledging that we're all coming at this from a different place. So yeah, I think you see a lot of this dynamic, I think, between the developing and the developed world. I think we've actually learned a lot from cities in the developing world about how to address our own greenhouse gas emissions, and I think there's, you can kind of flip the direction on its head a little bit.
Do you think that the sustainability initiative, and really for any city, making it more efficient and more sustainable will make it more equitable, and not so much that it's going to lower my standard of living, but that it's going to kind of like raise other people's standard of living because it's going to be less expensive and because it's going to be a more sustainable city in itself? Do you think that that is a true statement?
I think sustainability can, but it's not necessarily going to happen automatically. I think you have to be very intentional about it. I think one example that comes to mind is, while I've talked a lot about buildings, transportation is still 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions. There are a lot of ways you can go about reducing emissions from the transportation sector. What we are not going to do is just say, we're just going to do electric vehicles and that's going to, take care of the problem, because then that's going to reinforce some existing inequalities when it comes to the way transportation, assets are distributed. Not everyone can afford a car. Not everyone wants a car, and so I think that's...
I don't want a car.
Yeah, exactly. So I think yes, climate action and sustainability can help address problems of equity, but it's not unless you're very intentional about it.
Got it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was also hoping to hear from either Tom Peterson or Marcus on those, in the way what we export our standard of living elsewhere.
So as an international affairs professional, my ambit is really looking at foreign affairs. And so one of the things I teach in my classes is that the ecological footprint of the United States is greater than sort of the actual territory of the United States, right? So we're projecting our ecological footprint into in the rest of the world. And in fact, the world's ecological footprint is greater than what we call the carrying capacity of the world, even at this point. So I think you were looking for solutions, right? What I think is really important is a development program for foreign assistance that looks at our responsibility for countries that have contributed a lot less to the problems of emissions, for example, than we have. And so things like the flexibility mechanisms, things like climate finance projects, things like putting money into disaster risk and resilience in countries that are more likely to, not have that finance domestically. So to me, if you look at sort of the three elements of foreign affairs, one's defense, the other's development, and one's diplomacy, I see it mostly as a development challenge in ways that we can spend money, the United States, along with the multilateral development agencies, to build resilience in countries that will then create efficiencies, for example. And so also, along with that comes the responsibility, I think, to enable and facilitate technology transfer so other countries don't need to develop in the same sort of dirty way as we did. So, nuclear power, electric vehicles, the technologies that have already been matured in the United States, making sure that patents that exist, for example, all these are ways that we can enable countries to develop along patterns that are more sustainable, hopefully then reducing our global ecological footprint relative to these other countries is how I look at it.
All right, we have 5 minutes left, and we're going to try and get through all of our questions because we didn't get to last time, but that's my goal this time. So on the left.
Sure. My name's Elizabeth, and I have hopefully a quick question for Chris and a question for Kate. The hydrogen science just sounds magical, really, to a non-scientist. It's really cool. I was just wondering if that technology were to expand and ramp up, would there be an issue around water scarcity, or would it be competing for water resources in areas with drought? And my question for Kate is sort of just my limited knowledge of building issues is all from the clean energy DC sort of effort to get that bill. But I've become aware that the district has some really awesome buildings, but it doesn't seem like there's always the know-how, the budget, the wherewithal to maintain them in the most efficient way. And I was wondering if you have anything to say about that, and also if there are things that people in this room or in this area can do to support sustainable DC and, achieving the lofty environmental goals of the district.
Start with Chris.
Okay. So obviously in a desert, you're not going to be able to use water electrolysis, but we have some areas like in the Panhandle area of Texas, it went through a 3 to 4 year serious drought. Lots of crop failures and that kind of stuff, but there was still enough rain that came that you can channel it off of the roofs of buildings and store it, and that it would run on rainwater. It only takes 2.3 gallons of water to make a kilogram of hydrogen, which is equal to a gallon of gasoline in BTU equivalent. Many of the fuels that we use actually consume more water than that. So it actually uses less or the same as the methods that we're making fuel today with. But then, you do have to be, concerned about that. It is better for it when there's, obviously more water around, either through rain or from groundwater.
So I think you raised an important issue, which is you can build the most awesome new building in the world that's supposed to be net zero energy, and if you don't operate and maintain it, it's probably not going to be any better than the old building next door. And so we've been trying to do a lot to incentivize, figure out what kind of training we can provide to the people who operate and maintain buildings, not just our district government buildings, because I think it's an issue that, it's true whether you're talking about public or private buildings. And so that's what the new building energy performance standard is going to get at that. And one of the reasons it's probably going to be pretty cost effective for a lot of these buildings to comply is that, we're talking about strategies like retro commissioning, which is a fancy way of saying making sure your building's running the way it's supposed to, can actually save a lot of energy without changing any of the equipment in your building. So we're working on a plan to do that in our own buildings. And are going to try to provide resources to the private sector to do the same.
All right, on the right.
Hi, bronchitis, sorry. Pamela Bingham, I'm an environmental engineer. I'm actually a graduate of the Hopkins Leadership Development Program in the Carey School. And I used to work for SICE on a program in DC called Empowering Neighborhood People. I'm finding myself in great disagreement about the extent to which DOEE, the District Department of Environment and Energy, has really extended itself to make the policies equitable. My question, first of all, is I work with a public housing community in Southwest near that beautiful monstrosity, the Nats baseball stadium. Every day they're trying to be moved out. They're living with mold, serious indoor air quality issues. It's DC public housing. So until you make the housing that exists that you actually have control over a more clean and green environment, and until you stop, or not you, Kate, specifically, but the district thinking that somehow it's green to export people and to gentrify them out of their neighborhoods, there are going to be climate problems and climate issues. My equity question for Peterson, Marcus, and you is, I come to these meetings, I'm usually one of a few African Americans. The conversations that I have in the African American community about these issues is very different. We're looking at survival. I'm also my family's genealogist, and so in Virginia, they're celebrating 1619 to 2019, and we're saying, are we going to be here in another 400 years? And it's not just about climate change policy, it's how climate change policy gets implemented without equity. So I have some real concerns about this discussion today. My question specifically for Dr. King, and you all can respond on how we're going to build equity into this climate change discussion, but my question for Dr. King is, will our military use its capacity, you talked about its capacity to deal with international issues, but would it use its capacity to quell domestic climate conflicts? And who determines if a domestic climate conflict is a national security concern?
So there are regulations about the use of the U.S. military internally within the country. It's called posse comitatus. So the U.S. military can't be used in, to respond to conflicts, for example, within the United States. But if you looked at things like responses to storms, responses to fires out west, for example, so we saw National Guard nationalized. We saw Army assets, airplanes, being used to drop plane retardant. And so, there's definitely a role for the military domestically. It's just not responding to climate conflict. It would be responding to some of the worst impacts of climate change. And I just wanted to say intergenerational equity is incredibly important, as a concept. So, it's looking at our children's futures and really thinking about, what are they going to ask? They're going to ask us what we did, during this very important time period. And, I really hope that we can tell them that we were, safeguards, good guardians, basically, of the future.
All right, we do have time for the last two questions, but they have to be very short. Minimize your preambles, and we will promise to answer them as efficiently as we can.
Thank you, Angela. My question is for Chris, and thank you for educating me on hydrogen. If I gather what you said, you spoke from the perspective of a hydrogen system that would displace fossil fuels for transportation and complement the grid. Now, is it possible for you to comment on two other actors on the system? One is the consumer. What would you say to the consumers of the benefits of hydrogen vehicles over electric vehicles, and also the manufacturers? The same thing. What are the pros and cons for manufacturers to produce hydrogen or electric vehicles? Thank you.
Sure. Good question. So a hydrogen car, you can fill up in 3 to 5 minutes with 10,000 psi pre-chilled hydrogen, 10 minutes with an ambient station, and you can go 350 miles on a 10,000 psi fill. So that's the same as what you do today on an internal combustion engine vehicle, but you're still driving an electric car because the fuel cell's making electricity out of the hydrogen and running electric motors. Whereas battery electric can take most of them, except for the Tesla with the supercharger, you're 6 to 8 hours to go 100 to 150 miles. So it's a much better transition to a green energy fuel for the customer. And you really don't have to lose anything or give up anything to go electric if you do it with hydrogen. From the car manufacturer's standpoint, it fits easier into they're not as heavy. So it's kind of a little bit of rocket science. The more weight you put on something, the more energy it takes to move it. Hydrogen's much lighter, so the car gets a really good efficiency in comparison. So it's definitely in the best interest of the consumer and the car manufacturers to make that. And even some of the manufacturers have decided and announced that they're going to eliminate the internal combustion engine manufacturing facilities within the next 30 years and not manufacture internal combustion engines at all and go all fuel cells.
Last question.
It always concerns me when we discuss what we need to do and then say, but we don't have the money. And I recall President Eisenhower's last speeches, one where he coined military-industrial complex, but his speech after that actually laid out more specifics. How many houses, how many hospitals, how many good green jobs in that context could we create if we didn't build one tank? He was very specific, whether it's tanks or wars or soldiers, the trade-off for our civilian domestic needs. And I'm concerned when the private sector is introduced as part of the solution, because that can make a basic need a commodity, a for-profit commodity. So can you address these contradictions, please?
How does the military view its expenditure in terms of, also being able to, I think what she's saying is to the detriment of climate investment in other sectors, the Department of Defense could be minimizing its investment in, its own technologies, like she said, tanks. How do you know that it grapples with those things? Because spending is inherently a climate change problem, right? When we spend money, we are creating emissions just because of the way that the economy works. So is there any way you can address that issue?
I think so. I mean, I mentioned way back, sort of alluded to the fact that I was a negotiator of environmental agreements, but I worked based in the Pentagon, so I was the Defense Department representative for the U.S. delegation to the UNFCCC process. And so, as I think I mentioned also, we are the largest energy user in the United States, and therefore probably the largest single energy user in the world in terms of things like our fleets. By fleets, I also mean vehicular fleets, naval task groups, and then also the Air Force. So when you put that all together, that's an enormous opportunity for mitigation. So there's two ways that I think there was mitigation. One is that I think they have what you might call more patient capital, which is the capital that's invested in the military. Frankly, the dollars might come a little more easily. But then again, the one thing that the military has always done well is thinking about the future, so planning for the future, but also developing technologies, GPS, the internet. So I think getting some of these technologies across what's known as the Valley of Death, that early area where investment is needed. As I was saying, the military does have some patient capital, and so there's the capacity to lead in terms of technological development as a large energy user that contributes to mitigation. And so if you speak to the war fighters, they might say, well, energy efficiency is great because it helps us with the logistical tail, moving fuel needs to be done less. So, but also the co-benefits of that are mitigation. And so I think they take both sides of the mission or the capacity seriously.
And a little bit in your answer, just as a final point, I think I heard that you're basically saying that, the way that defense invests their money could benefit us in the end, because there are a lot of technologies out there that exist today specifically because of defense. Weather radar would not exist if it were not for defense. And so another way to look at it would be to say that investment in defense is also an investment in domestic technology as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was the point I was trying to make.
Great. Dan, let us wrap it up.
We'll meet back here at 3:30 for our final keynote speaker. And again, thank you for your participation.
Thanks.
Sam, right? No. We met.
The all-day discussion on climate change, hosted by Johns Hopkins, continuing in just a bit with the keynote speaker. It's former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley talking about renewable energy. That should come up about 3:30 Eastern or so, and we'll have it live here on C-SPAN 2 when it resumes. While we wait for that, though, the start of the program from this morning with scientist and author Kirk Johnson, who's the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. We'll show you as much as we can of his comments until the program resumes live.
Good morning, everyone. So climate is a pretty big topic, and I'm going to really blow the boundaries out both on the temporal scale and the spatial scale.